I'm your host, Paul DiRienzo, in New York City. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces accused Turkey this week of launching a large land offensive targeting villages in northern Syria. That came despite a truce brokered by Russia between the Syrian army, Turkey, and Kurdish forces, under the plan agreed to by Turkish President Recep Erdogan and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Ankara considers the Kurds, YPG militia, a terrorist organization linked to Kurdish insurgents in Turkey. Russia has been a close ally of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper said Turkey was moving in the wrong direction by dealing with Putin. Trump had briefly imposed sanctions against Turkey, which were lifted after Turkey agreed in principle to a ceasefire. Trump ordered the withdrawal of U.S. forces in the region who had been protecting America's Kurdish allies. Dr. Tristan is a lecturer at the University of Queensland in Australia. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
You're in Australia, but you're keeping close watch. What led? I usually say in situations like this, what led to this situation? But we all know that it was Donald Trump's precipitous action withdrawing U.S. troops. In many places in the world, people want their U.S. troops to be withdrawn. In this region, Kurdistan, along the border between Syria and Turkey, people wanted the U.S. forces to stay. Why is there a difference there?
Probably worth noting that this conflict between Turkey and the Kurds, and even the Syrian Kurds, is nothing new, and it long predates Trump, and it long predates even President Erdogan, for instance. So there's been a long-running insurgency in Turkey since the 1980s by the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which many people regard the Syrian Kurds, the dominant party there, the Syrian Democratic Union, led by and their armed wing, the People's Protection Units, or the YPG, as the Syrian affiliate of this. So the leader of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, used to be based out of northern Syria, and this almost started a war between Syria and Turkey back in 1999. So this is a conflict that's raged for almost 40 years now. Over 40,000 people have died. In more recent terms, from 2015 until 2019, there's been an insurgency running in Turkey, where the International Crisis Group has recently released a report that at least 4,500 people have died since that time. So there is some reason why President Erdogan would be concerned about what he regards as a PKK affiliate setting up an autonomous zone on the Turkish border.
Mm-hmm. That's because Kurdish people live in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iraq, the three countries in the region, and Iran as well.
Yes, this is correct. Following the First World War, the victorious allies, principally the French and British, moved to carve up what was then the Ottoman Empire into mandates, with the French taking Syria and Lebanon, and the British taking Iraq, and what was then known as Palestine, and what is today Palestine and Israel, and more to the point, is that there were plans for what we now know as Turkey, which was going to be divided into a Greek area, including Istanbul, Italian spheres of influence, French spheres of influence, and also proposals for a Kurdish homeland and an Armenian homeland. And this would have left a very small rump state for ethnic Turks. And it was only because of fierce nationalist resistance that drove back the Allied powers that we know the Republic of Turkey as it is today. And this is why the Turkish government and Turks in general are very, very prickly about territorial integrity within Turkey. I remember back in 2013, when I was working in Iraqi Kurdistan, I visited the center of Turkey in Cappadocia, and I was asked what I was doing there. And I mentioned I worked in Kurdistan, and this was to a restaurant owner, and he went ballistic. So it's a very, very sensitive issue. And like I said, it does have very recent, like I said, over 4,500 people have died, 1,200 security force members of the Turkish government, and thousands of PKK militants. So this is very fresh in people's memories. That said, I think that what's happened is it's been very duplicitous of the United States government, who has for many years now said that the Syrian Kurds and the YPG and the Syrian Democratic Forces, who are a kind of a conglomeration that are led by the YPG, dominated by the Kurds, but also have various other ethnicities fighting for them, that they've been lauded as the most effective US-aligned ground troops fighting against the Islamic State group. And so it's quite treacherous that they're being left in the lurch, especially given that it seems that they were given guarantees previously of US support. There was a security arrangement agreed to in August, no less. So the YPG pulled back and destroyed their defensive fortifications, no less. And this also follows on the heel of a recent operation in one of the Kurdish enclaves, one of the self-declared regions, in Afrin, where the Turkish-led forces have been accused of ethnic cleansing. So there's a lot of fear on the Kurdish side as well. It's also a little
what does
sad
ethnic in this situation? I just want to interrupt just for get a clarification of what ethnic cleansing in this circumstance means, because that is being thrown around a lot.
This term is being thrown around a lot. It depends on whose reports you're going to believe. Of course, the Turkish government has said that they're not targeting Kurds. They are targeting the YPG, what it regards as a terrorist organization. And of course, there are 15 million, 20 million Kurds who live in Turkey itself. So it's a very sizable minority of 15 to 20% of the population. What this means is that either deliberately or through fear, people are fleeing these areas in their hundreds of thousands, leading to problems of redistribution of the population demographics. One of the goals of President Erdogan is to resettle several million Syrian refugees that have been residing in Turkey for several years now. So this not only in his buffer zone, this 20-mile buffer zone, that by doing so, he not only rids himself of a domestic problem that's costing him politically and financially. This influx of mostly Arab refugees will then further dilute the Kurdish identity of the region and fragment them even more. This also in turn actually benefits with a strange overlap with the Assad regime, because this influx of Arab refugees, the Syrian Arabs, will also mean that it will weaken Kurdish claims to self-determination within that region too. So there's an odd convergence of interests going on between the Assad regime, between Erdogan, between Vladimir Putin, of course, who now has come across as kingmaker in Syria and is looking very prestigious throughout the Middle East, insofar as when the conflict happened, he picked a side and he supported them, where the US approach has been very haphazard at best. It hasn't seemed to have any clear goals, let alone a strategy to achieve these. And we can see this by the fact that the Turkish proxies that are being used and being condemned are the very same proxies that were being supported by various regional and international powers a couple of years back when they were fighting to overthrow Assad. And it's still the same jihadists that are there, and that's quite worrying in its own right. And we've all seen the reports about kind of the mutilation of women fighters, and massacres and so forth. So it's very concerning.
Yeah, let's look at that for a second. I can see that. Women fighters, you mentioned. The Kurds have a different set of values in some ways than the people they're fighting with or against, aren't they? They have different values, values more aligned with Western values.
Analytically, it's very difficult to use the term Kurds, and this has been thrown about quite a bit in the mainstream media, because Kurds are extremely divided. As you noted before, they're between Turkey, they're between Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And so there's 100 years where they've been divided. Even within these areas, they're not homogenous groups. We're talking about a mass group of people. So not all the Kurds in Syria are PKK. They're not secular. In Iraq, they're heavily divided between two main parties that have gone to war with each other in the early 90s. The PKK and the Iraqi Kurds have gone to war. So it's important to realize that when we talk about Syrian Kurds, we're not talking about the YPG. And so it's quite analytically fraught when it's used like this in the mainstream media, because it kind of signifies this idea that it's there's good guys and there's bad guys, where you'll find that, say, the Iraqi Kurdish government and the Kurdish regional government in Iraq is very closely aligned with the Turkish government. And what's interesting is that you had the KRG president visit Turkey and being hosted by Erdogan and flown the Kurdish flag. So it's all very complicated when it comes down to it. Now, with the Syrian Kurds in particular and the YPG, if we are to believe the reports, they've been engaged in a very interesting experiment called democratic confederalism, which is predicated on the idea of small autonomous regions that work together, that are based on participatory grassroots democracy. The idea is that they are ethnically and gender inclusive, and that they're run by a series of committees. And within the leaders of these committees, one must be a woman, one must be a minority, and one will be a Kurd. So it sounds great in a region dominated by ethnic nationalism, by autocracies, and so forth. Even if they have been accused of their own abuses, it does seem like a pity that this experiment wasn't allowed to at least be given a chance.
Mm-hmm. What now that the U.S. has gone from this area, is this really a surprise, and how will the politics in the Middle East change under this sort of Trump ideology of America first and withdrawal and isolationism? We've never really seen isolationism since it was proposed really in the 1930s and prevented the U.S. from helping England for a long time in World War II. Is there similar parallels here, or is it something different?
Well, it seems a bit dubious to say necessarily that Trump is pulling out now that we've had announcements by Newsweek overnight or yesterday, I think, saying that there are plans within the White House to put tanks into northeast Syria to protect the oil fields there. So it seems quite odd that the withdrawal from northeast Syria entails actually just moving some tanks elsewhere. And then, of course, the earlier announcement that the US will be sending troops to Saudi Arabia. So it doesn't seem like there's a complete disengagement, but it will signal to other actors who are thinking about cooperating with the United States whether or not they can be trusted. This was dubious at the best of times, of course. But as I said, it does very much make Putin look like somebody who walks the walk in terms of following through on his promises. And he plays a weak hand incredibly well. Russia should not be able to exert this kind of influence given how weak their economy is. But the big winner in all of this will be Bashar al-Assad, who will be able to take back most of Syria. There will probably be some negotiations over Turkish support for the remaining rebels, the kind of al-Qaeda-led rebels in Idlib province. And he'll also be able to cast himself as the protector of minorities once more. Assad has been saying this throughout the conflict, that he was protecting the Christians, the Alawites, and so forth of Syria from jihadists, extremists. And now that the Kurds have thrown in their lot with Putin and Assad, that will go a long way to bolstering his claims. And eventually, I would suspect his rehabilitation as problematic and distasteful as that may be within the international community, I would suspect.
Does that makes this more a story about U.S. domestic politics than international politics? There's people are switching chairs a little bit, or playing musical chairs in the Middle East. What else is new? But in the United States, this is really playing out, between people who want to have closer relations, like Trump with Russia, and those who see Russia as a big enemy in Ukraine and different places. Is that really what this is about, Russia and the U.S.?
Definitely Trump is playing to his domestic base, I would say. We're back into your very extended presidential election season again. It's quite crazy for us in Australia. Our elections go for a month. Anything longer, we couldn't handle it. But he can claim to be fulfilling one of his promises, which was to stop wasting American lives and money in wars in the Middle East that people in the Middle East don't appreciate, for a variety of reasons, of course. So if this is kind of an isolationist move, I don't think you'll see too many people worried about it in the Middle East, but it does leave the Kurds very much in the lurch when it comes down to it.
It's terrible. And let's just wrapping up. What do you see coming out of this as far as the Kurds in Syria are concerned? Because it seems like there's different Kurds in different places.
I would say it's pretty bleak for the Kurds in Syria. Under the deal struck by Putin and Erdogan, they're required to, at least the armed forces are required to pull back out of that buffer zone. They'll be put back under Syrian rule. Perhaps they'll be integrated into the Syrian Arab army. Potentially, when they work out, or that Assad probably doesn't have any intention of getting into a conflict with the Turkish government, with the Turkish armed forces, and Russia will make sure that doesn't happen, I would suspect. They may revert back to insurgent methods, and this will give some credence to President Erdogan's claims that they are quote-unquote terrorists. So it's not looking good, and it's quite sad that what looked like potentially a bright spot for transformation, or political transformation in terms of government in the Middle East has been snuffed out before it's even had a chance to be tested.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Dr. Tristan Dunning is a lecturer at the University of Queensland in Australia. Thanks for joining us. Meanwhile, GOP Senator John Cornyn defended Trump's moves in Syria. He says the U.S. forces should stay clear of helping the Kurds, especially if Turkey's goal is ethnic cleansing, a radical departure from the policies of previous U.S. presidents. And you're listening to The Torch. I'm your host, Paul DiRienzo. Meanwhile, Trump tweeted Thursday that the U.S. military would continue securing oil fields in Syria. He also suggested America's one-time allies, the Kurds, also move to the oil fields region. Trump's tweets came after defense officials said the Pentagon was considering moving tanks into Syria for the first time. Kani Xulam is a native of Kurdistan. He says Kurds are still reeling after Trump's about-face.
It was a surprise. The Trump administration had told us to work with the Turks. They had urged us to dismantle our defenses, to withdraw our troops 5 kilometers inside Syria, so that Turks would not feel threatened. And even though the Kurds had never attacked Turkey, and then all this was going on for the last 2 months. And then all of a sudden, Trump last night at 11 p.m. said he's decided to withdraw American troops, and Erdogan is itching to get in, and it's going to be a slaughter. It could be that the impeachment proceedings are proceeding, and he doesn't like that, so he wants to create, an alternative agenda, if you will. People will talk about Syria and the Kurds and the slaughter and maybe refugees. It's not just Syria in terms of the safe area, the eastern Euphrates area. It's also there are massive protests inside Iraq too. But that's just a speculation on my part. I don't have inside knowledge about this issue. The Kurds found themselves fighting ISIS, who had also threatened the West, blew up buildings in Paris, in Berlin, in London, in Orlando, in San Bernardino, in New York. And so in 2014, the Kurds and the Americans found themselves facing the same menace, the same enemy. And they cooperated, and they defeated ISIS, and 11,000 Kurds died. And there are 1,000 American troops now on the ground on the eastern, like 1/3 of the country, northeast of Syria. And they had been kind of been an insurance policy, because Turkey doesn't dare to attack America, but it wants to bloody the nose of the Kurds. So, a lot of Americans had known this, because Turkey wasn't fighting ISIS. Kurds were willing to fight ISIS. Their Arab allies were fighting ISIS. They had come together under something called Syrian Democratic Forces. And so this marriage of convenience, if you will, started in 2014, October 2014, and it's been going on for the last 5 years. And last night, Trump pulled the plug, and God knows what's going to happen there. Turkey, if Turkey gets in, it has already, expressed a desire to dismantle the government there. And the Kurds, are a fact of life there. They want to work together with the central government in Damascus. It's not that they want to separate, even though they would love to separate, but they know that they don't have the power. And they wanted to have an autonomous region. But if Turks come and dismantle their government, it's going to be a bloodbath. The Kurdish leaders have said they're going to fight back, and it's going to be. They've already have had a lot of experience fighting ISIS. There are some 70,000 troops under arms. They've been trained by Americans for the last 5 years. So that's the fear we have, that it's going to be a bloodbath. Turkey doesn't want the Kurds to have, a place under the sun, if you will. They want Kurds to be leaderless, and they want Kurds to be docile. They don't want Kurds. The very presence of the Kurds for the Turks is an act of provocation. I mean, they're bigoted. They don't want the Kurds to have language rights, cultural rights. There are 20 million Kurds living in Turkey, for example, and they don't have a preschool in Kurdish. The Kurdish language is banned. There are like 300 to 400 television stations in Turkey. There's only one Kurdish television station, but it's heavily censored. It's on a tight leash in the hands of the government. It might as well be in Turkish. So it's bigotry at work. It's racism at work. It's intolerance of one race, one people towards the other, and especially of Erdogan towards the Kurds, the president of Turkey. Kurds inside Syria wanted to have an autonomous region. They wanted U.S. to support them because they had supported the U.S. In terms of getting rid of this menace. And they wanted to have U.S. backing in Geneva so that when the new government emerges, if it has peace with central government in Damascus with Bashar al-Assad, they wanted to have an autonomous region recognized in the constitution, so that they could teach their children Kurdish, so that they could have an autonomous region in Syria where they are the majority, the way it is in Iraq. For example, northern Iraq is Iraqi Kurdistan, and in 2005, the constitution of Iraq recognized that, and now the Kurds have an autonomous region, and the Kurds of Syria wanted the same that their cousins enjoy in northern Iraq. My fear is Turkey will move in, and these 70,000 battle-tested Kurdish fighters and their Arab allies will fight back, and it will generate more refugees. The first wave of refugees, in terms of when Bashar al-Assad was dominating killing his people, millions moved to Europe, and then it caused all kinds of upheavals in Europe in terms of Brexit, in terms of alternatives for Germany, the neo-Nazi party coming to power, getting 13.4% of the vote. So it's, in the long run, if the world wants peace, the world needs to address this issue sensibly. It doesn't need to cater to bigots like Erdogan. Otherwise, we're going to have more refugees, and we're going to have more chaos. And more chaos in the Middle East doesn't mean more peace in the world. It just means more chaos in the world, too. The Kurds thought this time around maybe, the Western leaders will smell the coffee, if you will see the threat. But apparently, they're not there. They thought that America was going to, rain on the imperialist Turkey, and then keep it, within its borders. But the brakes have been lifted, if you will, and now Turkey wants to move in, and it will definitely be more chaotic, and I think the ramifications will be felt across the world.
Kani Xulam is a native of Kurdistan. Edmund Ghareeb is an author and educator who has written several books in the field of Kurdish studies. He says the United States is not alone at playing the Kurds' desperation for their own territory.
Not only the United States, but other powers who at times have worked with the Kurds have also used them as pawns at times. The problem is that the Kurds have been viewed sometimes as wonderful freedom fighters, good friends, good allies, at other times as terrorists, as tribesmen and backward tribesmen. And so there are different perspectives. But basically, the Kurds have often been used by superpowers, and the United States, I would say the first time they abandoned the Kurds, or at least worked and allied themselves with opponents of the Kurds, was when the first Kurdish republic was ever, and the only one, established in Iran in 1946-47, and it was known as the Mahabad Republic. That republic was supported by the Soviet Union and by the Kurds in Iran. But the United States and Britain supported the Iranian government and helped crush that republic within, actually it survived about a year or so. Trump has been saying since the beginning, since the time he was a candidate, when he first came to the White House, and after that, that he wanted to withdraw from Syria. He wanted to end what he called these stupid wars, these endless wars and conflicts, and that it was not in the interest of the U.S. to remain. However, whenever he said that and he made some moves to withdraw, there was also pressure on him, as was the case about a year or so when he said he was going to withdraw, and ultimately about 1,000 troops were withdrawn, but then the Pentagon maneuvered to remain on the ground in Syria and to continue the current policy of supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are primarily led by and mainly Kurdish forces. What is the U.S. doing in Syria? They are not there at the invitation of the Syrian government. Yes, the Syrian government is an authoritarian government, a repressive government. Nevertheless, this was a civil conflict supported by outsiders, including supporting extremist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So what is the purpose of the U.S. presence in Syria without the approval of the UN, without a congressional resolution, and without also with the invitation of the Syrian government, which is internationally recognized? And now we hear that the reason was primarily to block, to block Iran from expanding its influence from Tehran to Iraq, from Iraq to Syria, from Syria to Lebanon, where they support Hezbollah, and maybe to Gaza. That is one of the objectives that has been described. Another objective is to help protect Israel. A third objective has been mentioned, that the United States also wanted to be a player whenever there was a settlement in Syria, primarily by controlling one of the richest, about a quarter to a third of Syria's richest region, both agriculturally as well as in terms of oil and gas, and that would give the U.S. a voice in any kind of future negotiations, particularly as the Syrian government has regained control over much of Syria with the support of Iran and the support of Hezbollah, and of course the support of Russia. And so, but beyond that, I mean, it does not seem that there is a coherent policy that the U.S. has towards Syria. I think basically what we are going to see is that even Trump now is saying that if apparently there is some kind of an understanding between Turkey and the U.S. on this. There was a conversation Saturday night between Trump and Erdogan. Now, what that conversation, what did it entail specifically, it's not very clear, but it's obvious from what President Trump has said is that if Turkey goes beyond what's acceptable, sort of implying what has been agreed upon, then he's going to use economic sanctions and destroy Turkey's economy and put pressure on Turkey this way, and that Turkey will pay a heavy price. Now, what does that mean? I mean, is it that there is this security zone that has been talked about, which is probably 5 to 7 kilometers? That is probably would not be sufficient for the Turks. The Turks apparently are not only worried about the Kurdish forces, which they see as an existential threat to Turkish security because they view Syrian Kurds as part of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is the party which has been fighting the Turkish government since 1982. Now, the Turks also have another objective. That objective is primarily they want to settle at least 1 million to 2 million, maybe, Syrian refugees who are in Turkey in this zone. That becomes much more explosive, much more dangerous, because this might mean demographic changes on the ground in this area. The 5 to 7 kilometers may not be sufficient. Also, that the Kurds this time may fight, unlike what they did in Afrin when the Turks moved and their allies, Syrian allies and other allies moved in and took over the region of Afrin in northern Syria. Now they might fight, so that will complicate the situation even further. And the Turks have already said, the Turkish vice president, that U.S. threats are not going to stop Turkey from achieving its objective. The U.S. could ultimately say that we are going to withdraw. What people forget, that's why it supposedly came as a surprise, but if we had been following the news a few days ago, and even earlier, there was about 4 or 5 days ago, there was an interview with a U.S. official who said there is a big storm brewing in that part of the world, and we may not have sufficient forces on the ground. We may have to withdraw. So basically, this should not have come as a surprise. I think primarily what we are the most important thing is, are we likely to see negotiations between the Syrian government and Kurdish forces? There have been attempts in the last few months and even the last couple of years to try to get the two sides working together, because both are opposed to the Turks. I think we might see some efforts in this direction. Whether they will succeed or not, that's another question.
Edmund Ghareeb is an author and educator who has written several books in the field of Kurdish studies. You're listening to The Torch. I'm your host, Paul DiRienzo.